So thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, the UK is meant to be leaving the EU this Friday.
Yes.
Do you think that's going to happen?
No, I don't. I think the Prime Minister's asked for an extension from the EU, and I think that the likelihood is that they will give us an extension, and that it probably will end up being a long extension. So we're talking about a year or perhaps even longer than that.
I mean, do you think the Tory party can hold together if that happens?
I think it's very difficult for the Tory party to hold together at the moment because what is very clear is that if the long extension, and they'll ask for a reason, the Commission will ask for a reason, if the long extension is designed for the UK to essentially soften Brexit so that we have a customs union and high regulatory alignment, which is the Labour proposal, and that is obviously what they are discussing now, that will be regarded by the majority of Conservative MPs as not actually Brexit. And it would be right, because in order for Brexit to make sense, you have to have some forward opportunities. And if you don't have any forward opportunities, and those forward opportunities are contained only within an independent trade policy and an independent regulatory policy, if you don't have that, and I know people say, well, you can still have an independent trade policy inside a customs union. The problem is that you can't really have a strong independent trade policy because, like Turkey, for example, which has a customs union, partial customs union with the EU, they have to follow the EU into their negotiations. They take the burdens of them without getting any benefits, and then they have to negotiate their benefits for themselves. And we would be in the same position. Now, I don't really call that an independent trade policy. The Labour view that you could be in the customs union and still somehow have some say, or more say than we've had before, makes no sense, obviously, because if we couldn't have had a say meaningfully as one of 28, if you are in a customs union with the 27, clearly they're not going to give you more say in that situation. They're going to give you less or none at all. And so what is likely to happen is you're likely to end up with inability to have any of the future benefits of Brexit, and then all you're doing is limiting the damage of leaving the European institutions, and you're becoming a rule taker without a voice or a vote. Yeah. So it is clearly the worst of all possible worlds. My view has always been either you're fully in or you're fully out. The sort of halfway house doesn't exist. But what we've argued consistently is that, a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU is fully consistent with that independent trade and regulatory policy that we think is in the interests of the UK and will provide lots of benefits.
Yeah. Obviously, you mentioned that we need to be either fully in or fully out. Obviously, my understanding is that you eventually came around to backing the deal on the third meaningful vote. Yeah. Presumably, you think that deal is better than Remain. Even though it contains a
I think that deal is better than Remain. From the perspective of the forward benefits of the UK leaving the European Union, I think we will. It's not as if we can go back to the status quo now. We've gone through this process. We are not going to go back into the European Union and have the same benefits that we had before in terms of our rebates and all the rest of it.
Letter, basically.
No, I think if we were to cancel this process now and essentially sort of stay in the EU, we would be humiliated for a generation. I think it would be very, very bad for us. And I think long term, it's not a stable position. I think we'll end up being in the same position in 3 to 5 years' time. And remember, the EU is a dynamic organisation. It's not a static thing. It's changing. It's moving in an ever more anti-competitive, prescriptive, and political direction. That will continue, and we will get further and further apart. And then we'll be back in the same place. So I think this deal, the reason I said they should vote for this deal now, is because of all the alternatives. The alternatives are much, much worse. And the prospect of no deal, I think, is zero now. I think it's receded because it's clear that this Prime Minister will not allow the UK to leave the European Union without a deal. And this Parliament and this Speaker will work together to make sure that doesn't happen. So in the event that no deal is not impossible, then what do you have left? You have what's happening now, which I predicted would happen if they didn't vote for the deal, which is essentially she'll throw her lot in with the Labour Party and it'll be customs union, high regulatory alignment, single market, that sort of thing. and Brexit only gets softer from here. And then it takes away all the opportunities, and it becomes and you'll have a bad outcome. It will have a bad outcome, and then people will be desperate to go back into the EU. So the likelihood of a second referendum becomes much, much higher in a long extension, and people will be. I think what happened in the first referendum is, what we have to understand, and I've seen this now in the last 2 years, there is a very, very well-organised campaign, a very well-resourced campaign, on behalf of the sort of forces of the establishment that want us to be as tightly locked into the EU as possible. And those forces, were surprised by the first referendum. They didn't really think that could ever happen, and so they were sort of caught sleeping at the wheel in some respects. That doesn't happen twice in a row. They will make sure that the campaigning is intense, and I think from the perspective of people who wanted to leave, part of, I think, the European Union's strategy and the Commission's strategy was to make this process as difficult as possible, so that the British people would be demoralised, so that at the end of the day they would throw their arms in the air and say, it's all too difficult, we can't leave the EU, we'll just stay. Yeah. And I think that's part of an orchestrated campaign that has been going on behind the scenes for years, really. I mean, ever since the referendum. And for all these reasons, my view is, look, the most important thing is that we have a strong Brexit-focused leader in phase 2. That clearly isn't the current leadership. And therefore that's a premium. And if you can succeed in getting this deal through, and I only changed my view when there was essentially a transaction proposed, which is, I think, the only way that she leaves. And the transaction was essentially, vote for my deal and I will go. Yeah. And then she would be able to say that she got the UK safely out of the European Union. Yeah. It would be a good legacy for her. And she's essentially laying down her political life for the sake of the country, which I think is a great legacy for any Prime Minister to have. I think we were there at that point. Now, I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding amongst those who voted against the deal, which is that the deal is the customs union. Yeah. And it's very important, because if there is in fact a vote coming up that sort of puts the Labour deal versus her deal, it's really important that people understand that they are different. Yes, her withdrawal agreements gives all the leverage to the EU. If you had 100 points, if you did this between 0 and 100, the EU might have 80 points of leverage, as a result of her deal. But that doesn't mean you have 0, and it doesn't mean you can't actually negotiate with other people. I have long believed that we could actually put in place the sort of, plans for the future that I've proposed, which involves US leverage, CPTPP accession, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, getting the Japanese on board, getting the Americans on board, getting external actors, onto our side of the table. I fully believe that is possible. But it will require us to get the deal done and then immediately go into this phase, immediately put a free trade agreement on the table with the European Commission, immediately take that to the US, take advantage of a narrowing window with the US, which goes up until the US primaries in that March of next year. And I think you could actually ensure that you have a negotiation so that by the time we leave the implementation period, whether that's December 2020 or with the extended implementation period after that, that we would not have to go into the backstop, that we would be able to go into these other arrangements. And in fact, the CDU basically have said, look, if we have to negotiate for 5 days on alternative arrangements intensively, let's do that. So they're open. I mean, the irony here is that the European Union seems to be more open to the ideas that we propose than our own government. But I think all of this is possible. So I think it's very important for people who are voting on, if they do have a chance, they may not get the chance. Yeah. They may only end up voting on her agreement with the Labour Party. But if they do have a chance to vote for her deal versus the Labour agreement, they need to understand that we have a possibility of getting out of the European Union in a successful fashion with her deal. We have no possibility of that with the Labour proposal.
Yeah. And I guess the critics of the current deal would say that because of the backstop mechanism and the potential to get stuck in a customs union, if the EU was so inclined, it could be unfriendly towards us, and obviously a lot of people would argue that's happened already. And that therefore it gives the EU the opportunity to kind of keep us in a customs union via the back door. I mean, do you think that's a realistic risk, or do you think that's...
Well, it is a risk. Of course, it's a risk. And what you have to do is you have to evaluate risk, and a lot of this is based on fine judgments. My own judgment, based on 25 years of trade policy experience, and I have to say it's shared by other people who have that sort of experience in trade policy around the world, like my advisory council of trade commissioners. Our view is that while that is a risk, if you're able to leverage your external leverage in terms of other countries and other people with whom you can do deals, then from their perspective, they're saying, look, a major G7 nation's about to adopt an independent trade policy for the first time. It's a huge potential impact for the world. It's really hard. It's really important for all of them that somebody pushes back on the export of the European regulatory system, which is happening around the world. So we're on the right side of that, or we could be on the right side of that table and the right side of that argument. And they will therefore align with us. And if we're able to do that, if we're able to sort of drive forward on those sorts of things aggressively, and it will require an incredibly aggressive approach. It will require just real, as they say in Latin America, real cojones, balls of steel, because you'll have to face up to the European Union. You'll have to draw down a lot of leverage against them, and you'll have to be prepared to, if necessarily, threaten to sue them, and I mean, all kinds of things will have to be done. And I think if they are done, then we have a shot of a successful result. The other thing that happens is once we're out and we're negotiating with them, DG Trade becomes more involved. We have other bits of the Commission that become more involved, that are more amenable to our vision of free trade agreement, etc. And in fact, DG Trade understand the issues that we're trying to deal with in terms of regulatory barriers around the world, because they deal with them in other countries like China and so on. So I think the constellation of characters we'll be dealing with will change in the when we're actually out of the EU.
I mean, obviously you mentioned kind of playing hardball, but do you think the current Parliament would let us play hardball? Because I mean, thus far at every stage they've got, they pull back from the brink, or they put in the government back from the brink. Do you think they'd have to be a general election?
Well, no. The mistake here, I think, the people have made is first of all, you don't negotiate with every member of Parliament. So no country will negotiate with all the members of Congress in the US or all the members of Parliament in the UK, and I think we're seeing why in the last few weeks why no one will do that. So the government actually has to take control of the process. Now, what they do typically in any normal situation is you do your deal with the EU and you bring that back to Parliament, and Parliament can, yes, vote up or down. What they can't do is go into what they're doing now. They can't go into the minutiae of the deal and say, well, we don't like this bit, we like this bit. That can't happen.
Yeah.
So I think a new government could certainly say, we're negotiating, here's the result, FTA, that we've negotiated, and we're sending it back to Parliament, and Parliament can vote up or down. Yeah. And if Parliament votes down, then we don't have a deal. And if Parliament votes yes, then we have the deal and we move forward.
Do you have any...
And the same thing, by the way, would apply to the US deal, to the TPP arrangement, all of it. And every trade vote, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of trade votes in the US, all trade votes are very close. They are always won by one or two people, because there's always protectionist interests that don't want to give up their protection, and the deal is made such that the people who need to demonstrate to their constituents that they are not giving up the protection are able to do that, while a caucus is worked up so that the deal eventually passes. It's very difficult, but it's just how trade works.
I mean, which Conservative kind of leader do you think could potentially lead the UK along this path?
I think a lot of them. I think you just have to believe in. First of all, you have to believe in the country. I mean, there seems to be a declinist, fatalist view in the UK establishment that we are a third-rate power in decline, and that's just not how the rest of the world sees us. Now, we could behave like that. We are behaving like that now, but we don't have to behave like that. We're the second biggest exporter of services. We're the fifth biggest economy in the world. We should start behaving the way we are. I think a leader who understands that, a leader who understands the geopolitics and the geoeconomic and geostrategic angle here of what the UK is. Not only are we all the things I just said, we're also the biggest soft power player in the world. Survey after survey, and the Munich Security Conference recently said, the UK is the biggest soft power player in the world. So you put all that together and you have a real viable force. And you need a leader who understands that, and you need a leader who understands the global dimension, what is actually happening in the world. What's happening in the world is there is a battle between essentially pro-competitive regulation, competition on the merits, where your success or failure is determined by your hard work and your ideas and not who you know in the government, versus a anti-competitive prescriptive regulatory system, which is the EU system or the China system, where the regulations are very much top down. This is how it's going to be, and if you want to deal with us, if you want to sell to us, then you have to be identical to our regulatory system, which is, I think, the big threat for the world. Because if you live in that world, then that's a world where money is destroyed out of the economy, and people are pushed into poverty, and it's the poorest people who suffer the most. So I think that's the big game that's going on in the world, and I think you need a leader who understands that. You need a leader who is sufficiently over the detail that that doesn't mean they're a micromanager. It just means that they are over the detail enough to know how to play the political international political game. And in trade negotiations, every technical thing is also a political thing. So, for example, the famous barcode, which is plaguing the arrangements on the island of Ireland, is you have to have a barcode under the Union Customs Convention, the Union Customs Code, and the Common Transit Convention, so that a lorry that crosses the border has to have this barcode that's read by a facility that's on the border. Well, this is 1980s technology. The Common Transit Convention can and should be updated. The French, in their no-deal planning, said they're going to do away with it, so it's clearly possible. Well, somebody should have known at the time that this very technical detail of our negotiation was actually very political. And so I've said that we need to negotiate, change the way we negotiate. We need to have political heavyweights negotiating. The Prime Minister needs to appoint, whether it's privy councillors or just political heavyweights who are able to be part of the negotiating team on a day-to-day basis. So we need to move away from a world where ministers basically come in at the final stage and sign on the dotted line, and actually have real political negotiations that are supported by civil servants, led by our chief trade negotiating advisor, Crawford Faulkner, but not led by, not done by civil servants.
I mean, do you think that the European Union, or say some countries within the European Union, have exaggerated the Northern Ireland backstop issue for political reasons?
Of course. Well, I think it was a gift to them. I think
which the UK government signed up.
Which the UK government not only signed up to, but wrote the worst parts of. So I mean, Sabine Wayand rightly says that this is the backstop is a British construct. It's not what the EU wanted, which was unacceptable, was to basically have Northern Ireland carved off the rest of the UK into the European Union and single market, and then GB would be separate. That was obviously not acceptable. But it's the UK that then came back and had this backstop arrangement where the whole of the UK would essentially be locked into the customs union and regulatory alignment. But the EU, though, I will say, has in the past consistently said that they want to do a comprehensive free trade agreement with the whole of the UK, not just GB. That's what Michel Barnier said to us when we went out to meet with him. the whole of the UK with customs facilitations, Irish border facilitations, and regulatory cooperation. Those Irish border facilitations are the alternative arrangements that we have been working on, and that in fact the European Union discussed with Leo Varadkar when they were talking about no deal planning on the Irish border. They were looking at alternative arrangements to keep the border, to ensure the border is not a hard border. So, I'm baffled that when you have the two parties so close, we want a comprehensive free trade agreement, they want a comprehensive free trade agreement, we want facilitations, they want facilitations, we want regulatory cooperation, they want regulatory cooperation, why it is impossible for us to come to an agreement on this. So I think we can come to agreement on this, but you need to have a different a team and a different approach, and I think you also need to understand that this is a single negotiation. The UK trade policy, UK independent trade policy, which includes the EU, is one whole. It isn't a EU policy over here and a rest of world policy over here. And I think that's one of the problems, is they've regarded it as an EU policy, which is really important, and the rest of the world policy is a sort of, icing on the cake. Nice to have bonus. Well, it's not a nice to have bonus, it's the whole game. And the whole thing collectively, they feed off each other. The better we're doing on our rest of the world policy, the more likely it is we'll have a good agreement with the EU.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. So obviously, at the moment, the Conservative Party is hopelessly split over Brexit. Well, there's obviously a new Brexit party led by Farage, which presumably will be standing candidates from election, etc. Does it worry you, as someone who cares about freedom and free markets, that the net result of Brexit could be Corbyn becoming Prime Minister? The British right becomes so divided that Labour is able to push its way through the general election.
It is a huge risk, and that's one of the factors that went into my mind in deciding that I think we probably need to accept this deal now and move on, because I think that is an enormous risk, and I think because the result of not accepting a deal would be a softening. What's happening now? Essentially a customs union EEA type arrangement that really won't fly with the Conservative Party. That will split the Conservative Party completely. It will keep people away from elections. It will keep people away from support of local councillors, local council elections. You name it, and that will open the door to a Corbyn-led government.
Brilliant. So on that rather negative, thank you very much for your time. It's been very kind.